The notice was taped to my food truck windshield at 6:45 in the morning. Not slipped under the wiper blade the way a parking ticket goes. Taped, deliberately, squarely, centered on the glass with what appeared to be an entire strip of packing tape across the top, as if the person who placed it wanted to make absolutely certain it would not blow away, would not be missed, would be the first thing I saw when I came out of my house at 6:45 a.m. to start my prep for the day. I peeled it off. The tape left a residue stripe across my windshield that I would spend 10 minutes removing later. Cease and desist notice. Violation of Ridgewood Park HOA Commercial Vehicle Ordinance, Section 8, Clause F. Commercial vehicles may not be parked on residential property or community streets within the Ridgewood Park development between the hours of 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. Additionally, operation of a commercial food service vehicle from a residential address is prohibited under Section 12, Clause B, which restricts home-based business operations visible to the community. You are ordered to remove the vehicle from community property immediately and cease all food service operations conducted from this address. Failure to comply will result in fines of $500 per day and potential legal action. Signed, Linda Frazier, HOA Board President, Ridgewood Park Community Association. I read it twice. I folded it carefully and put it in my apron pocket. I went back inside and poured myself a second cup of coffee because this was going to require a second cup of coffee. And I thought about the phone call I had received 4 months ago from the city's Office of Economic Development. The woman who had called was named Director Patricia Wales. She had said, "Mr. Chen, we've reviewed your application for the city's Mobile Food Vendor Partnership Program. We'd like to offer you a contract." I thought about that contract, about the specific language in it, about the city attorney who had reviewed it before I signed it, about the particular legal relationship between a municipal contract and a private homeowners association's regulations. I thought about Linda Frazier tapping that notice to my windshield at what must have been 6 in the morning, in the dark, and what she did not know when she did it. Then I finished my coffee and I called my city liaison. My name is James Chen. I am 38 years old and I am the owner and operator of Jade Garden on Wheels, a food truck that has been operating in this city for 4 years. I specialize in a fusion of Cantonese and American Southern cuisine, a combination that sounds improbable until you eat it, at which point it sounds inevitable. My braised short rib bao has been written about in 3 publications. My sweet corn congee won a regional food truck competition 2 years ago. I have a following, I work hard, I love what I do. I bought my house at 22 Sycamore Ridge in the Ridgewood Park HOA community 2 years ago, specifically because the driveway was long and wide enough to accommodate my truck. Food trucks are not small. Mine is 22 feet long and 8 feet wide and needs a substantial parking surface that can handle its weight. My driveway is 40 feet of reinforced concrete, original to the house, built by a previous owner who had a boat and a trailer and understood the requirement. I had checked the HOA rules before I bought. The CC and RS mentioned commercial vehicles in Section 8, Clause F, the same clause Linda Frazier had cited, but the provision, as I read it, applied to commercial vehicles parked on community streets, not on private driveways. My truck parks on my driveway, which is my private property. I had also checked with the city before I applied for the Mobile Food Vendor Partnership Program, specifically asking whether operating from a residential address created any licensing complications. The city's response had been no. The truck's registered address for licensing purposes was my home address, which is standard for sole proprietors, and the city had no restriction on where a licensed vendor resided. What I had not done, and this is the part I will acknowledge directly, was notify the HOA board that I was applying for the city contract or that my truck would be parked at my address nightly. I had checked the rules, concluded my situation was compliant, and proceeded without a conversation I probably should have had. In retrospect, that conversation would have been faster and less dramatic than what actually happened, but it also would have been less instructive for everyone. Let me tell you about Linda Frazier. Linda has been HOA board president of Ridgewood Park for 3 years. She is 61, recently retired from a career in corporate compliance, and brings to the HOA the same systematic documentation habits that presumably served her well in corporate life. She is organized. She is thorough. She is the kind of person who reads every clause of a document and then reads it again. She is also the kind of person who, when she has concluded that a rule is being violated, acts on that conclusion with complete confidence and without first asking whether there are facts she might not be aware of. She had seen my truck in my driveway. She had read Section 8, Clause F. She had concluded there was a violation. She had acted. What she had not done was ask me a single question. Not, James, what is that truck? Not, James, are you aware of Section 8? Not, James, is there something I should know about this situation? Just the notice, just the tape, just the $500 per day. I want to be fair to Linda. She was following her process. Her process produced a notice. Her process did not include a conversation first. That process was about to encounter something it had not accounted for. Let me explain the Mobile Food Vendor Partnership Program, because it is the foundation of everything that follows. The city's Office of Economic Development created this program 3 years ago to support small food businesses and improve access to prepared food in underserved neighborhoods. Participating vendors receive a city contract that grants them designated operating locations throughout the city, priority permitting at city events, inclusion in city promotional materials, and a small monthly operational subsidy in exchange for committing to serve at least 2 designated community locations per week. The contract is with the city. It is a municipal contract, the same legal category as contracts the city signs with road maintenance companies, park service providers, and event operators. Here is the part that matters. Municipal contracts in our state carry with them specific legal protections derived from the principle of regulatory preemption. The idea that when a state or municipal government has authorized and contracted for a specific activity, private entities, including homeowners associations, cannot prohibit or materially interfere with that activity through their own regulations. This principle is not absolute. It has limits and nuances. But in the specific case of a city-contracted mobile food vendor operating a licensed vehicle that is registered and domiciled at a residential address, the city's legal department had been very clear about this when I asked. The city's authorization takes precedence over private covenant restrictions that would prohibit the operation. In plain language, Linda Frazier's HOA could not ban my food truck because the city had already said I could have it. I had not known this when I first applied for the contract. I had learned it during the contracting process when the city attorney's office had walked me through the legal framework. They had told me, if you ever have trouble with a private covenant, here is the statute and here is our legal contact. I had written it down. I had put it in the contract folder. I had not expected to need it within 4 months. I needed it now. The phone call. My city liaison is a woman named Maria Delgado who works in the Office of Economic Development and who has, in my experience, exactly the right combination of warmth and competence for her job. She answers her phone. She knows her files. She understands the program she administers. I called her at 7:15 a.m., still in my driveway, holding Linda's notice. I said, Maria, I have a situation. I received a cease and desist notice from my HOA this morning ordering me to remove my truck and stop operating from my address. She was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. She said, send me the notice. I'll have our legal team contact the HOA today. I said, today. She said, James, you have a city contract. When someone tries to interfere with a city-contracted vendor's ability to operate, that's not just your problem. That's the city's problem. Send me the notice. I photographed it and emailed it from my driveway. She said, are you still planning to operate today? I said, I have a lunch service at Riverside Park and an evening stop at the community center on 5th. My schedule is on the city portal. She said, "Good, do your service. I'll be in touch." I put my phone in my apron pocket and started my prep. At 9:45, while I was loading the truck, my phone rang, not Maria, a number I didn't recognize. I answered. A man said, "Mr. Chen, this is David Park, Assistant City Attorney. I've been briefed on the notice you received this morning. I want to walk you through a few things." David Park spoke for 12 minutes. He was precise and methodical and used no unnecessary words, which I appreciated. He explained the regulatory preemption principle. He explained the specific statutory provision that protected city-contracted vendors from private covenant interference. He explained that the city would be sending a formal letter to the Ridgewood Park HOA board that day from the city attorney's office, explaining the legal framework and requesting that the cease and desist notice be withdrawn. He said, "Mr. Chen, you don't need to do anything. The city will handle the communication with the HOA. If they persist in their enforcement attempts after receiving our letter, we have remedies available." I said, "What kind of remedies?" He said, "The city can seek an injunction preventing interference with a contracted vendor's operations. In cases of documented interference, there are also provisions for the city to pursue recovery of any economic damages the vendor experiences." I said, "Economic damages?" He said, "If your operations are disrupted by the HOA's unlawful interference, the city has an interest in making you whole. You're operating under our contract. We stand behind that." I said, "I appreciate that, Mr. Park." He said, "One more thing. The city attorney's letter is going out today. I'd suggest you not respond to the HOA directly until they've received and processed it. Let the letter do its work." I said, "Understood." I finished loading the truck. I drove to Riverside Park. I served 240 lunches between 11 a.m. and 2 p.m., including a run of 40 consecutive short rib bow orders that I consider a personal record. My phone buzzed at 2:15 with a text from Maria. It said, "Letter delivered. Watch your inbox for updates. You have good food, James. Don't let anyone stop you from making it." I drove to my evening stop smiling. Linda Frazier received the city attorney's letter at approximately 3 p.m. I know the approximate time because of what happened at 4:30, which I will tell you now. At 4:30, while I was doing my evening service at the community center, I received a call from a number I recognized as Linda's. She had called me once before, months ago, about a separate parking question. I let it go to voicemail. The voicemail was 47 seconds long. Linda's voice was controlled, but had, underneath the control, the particular quality of someone who has just read something they were not expecting and is in the process of recalibrating. She said she had received a letter from the city attorney's office. She said she needed to discuss the situation with me. She said the board would be reviewing the matter and would be in touch. She did not apologize. She did not withdraw the notice. She did not say she had been wrong. But the 47-second voicemail, carefully controlled, from a woman who had taped a $500 per day cease and desist to my windshield 12 hours earlier, told me everything I needed to know about where things stood. The board meeting was in 9 days. 9 days was enough time to prepare. And I had learned from 4 years of running a food truck that preparation is everything. Quick version, I'm James Chen, owner of Jade Garden on Wheels food truck. My HOA board president Linda Frazier taped a cease and desist to my windshield at 6:45 a.m., ordering me to remove my truck and stop operating from my address. What she didn't know, I have a direct contract with the city's Mobile Food Vendor Partnership Program. Municipal contracts carry regulatory preemption. The city's authorization overrides private covenant restrictions. The city attorney sent Linda a letter that afternoon. She called me 47 seconds of controlled panic at 4:30 p.m. The board meeting was 9 days away. This is part 2. The 9 days. I want to tell you what I did in those 9 days, because it matters for understanding what happened at the meeting. Day 1, I called my own attorney, a woman named Sandra Cho who handles small business matters and who I had worked with since I started the truck. I walked her through the situation. She reviewed the city attorney's letter, the HOA's notice, and my contract. She confirmed David Park's analysis and added one thing he hadn't mentioned. The HOA's notice, if followed, would have caused me to breach my city contract, since the contract required me to maintain operational capacity on a specified schedule. Breaching the contract would have cost me the program's subsidy and potentially the contract itself. Sandra said, if the HOA had succeeded in forcing you to remove the truck, you'd have lost your city contract. That's recoverable economic damage with a clear causation chain. I said, I'm not looking to sue anyone. She said, I know, but they should know it's possible. I filed that away. Day 2, I walked my driveway with a tape measure. My truck, parked on my private driveway, sat entirely within my property lines. The nose of the truck was 8 feet from the sidewalk. It did not obstruct the street, the sidewalk, any neighbor's sight lines, or any common area. I documented this with photographs and a diagram. Days 3 and 4, I reread every relevant section of the CC and RS. Section 8, Clause F, the commercial vehicle provision, applied specifically to vehicles parked on community streets and common areas. My driveway is private property. The provision, properly read, did not cover my situation. Section 12, Clause B, the home-based business restriction, prohibited businesses that generated customer traffic at the residential address, had visible commercial signage, or created noise or disruption inconsistent with residential use. My truck parked in my driveway at night generated no customer traffic, had no signage visible from the street when parked, and made no noise. I drove it away each morning before 7 and returned after 9 p.m. The restriction, properly read, also did not cover my situation. Sandra reviewed my analysis. She said, you're right on both counts. Even without the city contract, the HOA's notice was based on a misreading of their own provisions. I said, I want to make that clear at the meeting. She said, you want to win on both grounds. I said, I want the record to show that the city contract protects me and also that the notice was wrong on its own terms. Both things are true. Days 5 through 7, I did something that was not strictly necessary for the legal situation, but that I felt was important. I cooked for my neighbors. Not a formal event, just an informal Saturday afternoon. I parked my truck in my driveway, set up a folding table on the front lawn, and invited the residents of Sycamore Ridge to come try some food. I posted a handwritten note on the mailboxes of the 12 nearest houses. Saturday afternoon, 2 to 5 p.m., free food, James at 22 Sycamore Ridge. 11 households came. I served braised short rib bao, sweet corn congee, my cold sesame noodles, and a new item I was testing, a Cantonese-style chicken and waffle that I had been developing for 3 weeks. People ate, people talked. People asked about the truck, about the routes, about the city program. I explained what I did and how I did it and why I loved it. Mrs. Patterson from number 18, who is 74 and has lived on Sycamore Ridge for 30 years, said, "This is the best thing I've eaten in years. What is this called?" I said, braised short rib bao. It's a Chinese steamed bun with a Southern-style braise inside. She said, "I want the recipe." I said, "It's a trade secret." She said, "I want to come to your truck. Where do you park?" I told her my schedule. She wrote it down on a notepad she produced from her cardigan pocket. 7 other residents asked for my schedule. I printed 12 copies of my weekly route card and handed them out. Linda Frazier did not come to the Saturday gathering. Her house is at 30 Sycamore Ridge, 8 houses down. She could see the folding table from her porch. She did not come. I noticed, but did not comment. Days 8 and 9, I prepared my presentation for the board meeting with Sandra's help. Clean, simple, 3 main points. the city contract, and the regulatory preemption principle, the misreading of the CC&R provisions, the documentation of my truck's actual impact on the community, which was zero negative impact and potentially positive impact, given that 11 households had now eaten my food and 8 of them had asked for my route card. Sandra said, "You're not just defending yourself, you're making an affirmative case." I said, "I run a food truck. Every service is an affirmative case." The Ridgewood Park HOA meets on the second Thursday of each month. The meeting room is in the clubhouse, standard issue, folding chairs, whiteboard, fluorescent lights, holds about 25 people comfortably. There were 31 people there when I arrived. I recognized most of them from the Saturday gathering. Mrs. Patterson was in the front row. The Nguyens from number 14 were there, and the Garcias from number 8, and at least 4 other households who had come by on Saturday. They had come to the meeting because they knew what it was about, and they wanted to see how it went. Linda Frazier was at the board table. She was composed, she is always composed, but there was something different in how she held herself that evening. A careful quality, the quality of someone who has read a city attorney's letter and spent 9 days thinking about it. The board has 5 members. Linda, a man named George Simmons who handles maintenance, a woman named Priya Nair who handles finances, 2 newer members whose names I had learned that week, David Hollies and Carol Watkins. Linda opened the meeting and moved through the agenda items with her usual efficiency. Then she said, "We have a resident matter. James Chen has requested time to address the board regarding a notice issued to his property." I stood. I said, "Thank you, Linda. I'll be organized and brief." I presented my 3 points. First, the city contract. I distributed copies of the relevant pages, the contract itself, the regulatory preemption statute, and a 1-page summary from Sandra explaining the legal framework in plain language. I said, 9 days ago, I received a notice ordering me to remove my truck and cease operations. That morning, I called my city liaison and forwarded the notice to the city attorney's office. The city attorney sent a letter to this board explaining that my operations are protected under the regulatory preemption principle. A city contracted vendor operating under a municipal contract cannot be prohibited from that operation by a private covenant. I said, "I'm not presenting this to be adversarial. I'm presenting it because the board needs to understand the legal framework before making any decisions about this situation." Second, the CC and RS. I walked through Section 8, Clause F, and Section 12, Clause B, both of which I had been cited under, and I explained why neither provision, properly read, applied to my situation. A truck parked on a private driveway is not a vehicle parked on a community street. A business that generates no customer traffic, has no visible commercial signage when parked, and creates no noise or disruption is not a visible home-based business operation. Even without the city contract, the notice was based on an incorrect reading of the provisions. Third, community impact. I placed on the table the documentation I had prepared, photographs of my truck parked on my driveway, entirely within my property lines, not visible from the street in any way that differed from any other large vehicle. I said, "My truck arrives after 9 p.m. and leaves before 7 a.m. It sits on my reinforced concrete driveway. It generates no noise, no traffic, no odor, no light. Its presence is indistinguishable from any public vantage point from a large personal vehicle." I said, "I also want to note that 11 households on Sycamore Ridge came to my property last Saturday when I offered them an opportunity to meet me and try my food. 8 of those households asked for my weekly route card. These are your constituents. They know what I do and they are interested in supporting it." I sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then George Simmons said, "I had the braised short rib bow on Saturday. That was extraordinary." Linda said, "George." George said, "I'm just knotting it for context. The man makes exceptional food." Linda said, "The board will focus on the legal and procedural questions." She was quiet for a moment, looking at her copy of Sandra's legal summary. Then she said, James, the city attorney's letter. Did you contact the city attorney before or after receiving our notice? I said, after. I called my city liaison the morning I received the notice. She escalated to the legal team. Linda said, and the regulatory preemption principle, were you aware of it before you parked the truck at your address? I said, I became aware of it during the contracting process. The city attorney's office walked me through it as part of the contract briefing. They told me to keep the documentation in case I ever needed it. Linda said, they anticipated this situation. I said, they deal with food vendors citywide. HOA issues come up. A pause. Priya Nair said, Linda, the legal summary is clear. The city contract protects his operations. Even if we wanted to enforce the provisions as written, we'd be facing a legal challenge from the city itself, not just from James. Linda said, I understand that. Priya said, then what is the board's position? Linda was quiet for a moment. She said, the board's position is that the notice was issued in good faith under a reasonable reading of our provisions, and that we have now received information from the city attorney and from James's legal analysis that requires us to revise that position. She said it carefully, not an apology, not quite, but an acknowledgement. She said, the board is withdrawing the cease and desist notice, effective tonight. Then she said something I had not expected. She said, I also want to note for the record that the board did not consult with James before issuing the notice. We saw what appeared to be a violation, and we acted without first having a conversation. She paused. That was a process failure. Before we issue notices for situations that involve any ambiguity, commercial vehicles, home-based activities, anything where the facts are not straightforward, we should speak with the resident first. She said it to the room, to the board members, to the 31 residents listening. George Simmons nodded. Priya Nair nodded. Mrs. Patterson, in the front row, nodded with particular conviction. Linda said, is there anything else from you, James? I said one thing. I'd like to formally submit my truck schedule to the HOA records so that anyone who has questions about my operations can see exactly when and where I park. Full transparency, ongoing. Linda said, that would be appreciated. Submit it to the board email. I said, I'll do it tonight. The meeting ended at 8:20. After the meeting, Mrs. Patterson caught up with me in the parking lot. She said, that was well handled. I said, thank you. She said, you made food for us on Saturday. You didn't have to do that. I said, I wanted people to know what I do. It's easier to understand when you can taste it. She said, Linda didn't come on Saturday. I said, I noticed. She said she will, eventually. That's how Linda works. She processes things and then she comes around and she doesn't make a big production of it. Give her time. I said, I'm not holding anything against her. She was doing her job as she understood it. Mrs. Patterson looked at me. She said, you know what the nicest thing about all of this is? I said, what? She said, my whole street knows about your truck now. You're going to have very good business from Sycamore Ridge. She went to her car. She was right. Linda. 3 weeks after the meeting, on a Tuesday afternoon, Linda Frazier came to my truck. Not at my house, at my Tuesday lunch stop, which is a parking spot on Meridian Avenue 4 blocks from the city park. She arrived at 12:30 when the lunch rush was at its peak and stood in line with everyone else. I saw her when she was 3 people back. I did not change my expression. I served the 2 people ahead of her, and then she stepped up to the window. She said, 1 braised short rib bao, please, and whatever you recommend as a second item. I said, the sweet corn congee. People either don't understand it or love it completely. She said, I'll take both. I made both. I handed them through the window. She said, how much? I said, first visit is on me. She said, James. I said, it's a standing policy for new customers. first visit is on me." She looked at me. She said, "Thank you." She took her food to a bench by the park entrance and ate alone, looking at the street. I watched her between orders when I could. She ate everything. She ate slowly, the way people eat when they are tasting something carefully. When she finished, she came back to the window. She said, "The congee, I've never had anything like it." I said, "It's a dish I've been working on for 4 years. It's made with sweet corn from a farm about 40 miles from here. Corn that good, you don't fight it, you let it be what it is." She said, "How did you come up with the combination, Cantonese and Southern?" I said, "My mother's family is from Guangdong province. My father grew up in Georgia. Sunday dinners at our house were interesting. Everything on the table had a story, and most of the stories were from different countries. One day I thought, what if I stopped treating those stories as separate things?" Linda said, "And started treating them as one thing." I said, "As one kitchen, yes." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "I apologize for how I handled the notice. I should have spoken to you first." I said, "I appreciate that." She said, "I'll be on your route card from now on." She walked back to her car. I served the next customer and the next and the next, the lunch rush still going, the truck doing what it does on a good Tuesday. Where we are now. Jade Garden on Wheels is in its second year of the city contract and recently renewed for a third. The renewal came with an expanded schedule, 3 designated community locations instead of 2, and a small increase in the monthly subsidy. The city's food program has been expanding, and my truck has been featured twice in city promotional materials as an example of what the partnership program produces. My Sycamore Ridge neighbors are regular customers. Mrs. Patterson comes to my Tuesday Meridian Avenue stop approximately twice a month and always orders the short rib bao and always asks if I've developed any new items, which I usually have. The Nguyens bring their children. The Garcias have become what I call regulars, people who show up reliably and whose orders I start preparing when I see them coming. The Saturday gathering has become an annual thing. Each August I park in my driveway, set up the table, and cook for the street. Different menu each year. Last summer I did a whole roasted duck that I had been planning for months. The summer before, a claypot rice that requires 3 hours of prep and 10 minutes to eat and is worth every second of both. Linda Frazier comes to the August gathering now. She arrived at the first one after the board meeting with a bottle of wine and stood in line like everyone else and ate 2 full servings of whatever was on offer. She told me afterward that she had started exploring Cantonese cooking at home, which she found challenging and interesting. I gave her a recipe for the steamed egg custard, easy enough for a home kitchen, elegant enough to be worth making. The HOA board revised its pre-notice consultation policy. Before any notice is issued for a situation that involves ambiguity, a board member must first speak with the resident. The revision was proposed by Linda, seconded by Priya Nair, passed unanimously. I submitted the revision, when I heard about it, as the most meaningful outcome of the whole situation. Not the city contract protection, not the legal victory, not the CC&R misreading being corrected, the policy change. The change in how the board relates to residents before it acts. That's the thing that helps everyone, not just me. My truck is in my driveway tonight, parked neatly on 40 feet of reinforced concrete entirely within my property lines, quiet and still. The city contract is in my filing cabinet. Sandra Cho's legal memo is there too, next to the original cease and desist notice that I kept because I am a person who keeps records. Tomorrow morning, I drive to Riverside Park for the breakfast service. I have a new item on the menu, a Cantonese-style French toast with condensed milk and a char siu filling that I have been testing for 6 weeks and am finally satisfied with. I am never done cooking, I am never done improving. That is what I love about this work. The truck runs, the city contract runs, the street knows where to find me. And Linda Frazier knows what sweet corn congee tastes like. That is enough, that is more than enough.